The night was silent in the quiet suburb of West University Place, Houston, Texas. December 17th, 1998. Dr. Claudia Benton kissed her husband goodnight, checked on her children, and went to bed. She had no idea that just outside her home, a shadow was moving through the darkness. A man who had slipped off a freight train less than a mile away. A man who had already killed. A man who would kill again before sunrise. By morning, Dr. Claudia Benton was dead. But here is what will haunt you for the rest of this video. The FBI already knew this man existed. They already had his name. And somehow, someway, he had slipped right through their fingers. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. So, the question you need to be asking yourself right now is this. How does a known killer, a man already on law enforcement's radar, walk free long enough to terrorize two entire countries? And when they finally caught him, what did he say that shocked everyone in that courtroom into silence? Stay with this story, because nothing about this case is what it seems. It began long before Houston, long before the freight trains became his hunting ground. To understand Angel Maturino Reséndiz, you have to go back to where everything started. A small, dusty town called Izúcar de Matamoros in the state of Puebla, Mexico, where on August 1st, 1959, a boy was born into poverty and confusion. Nobody who knew him as a child would have predicted what he would become. He was quiet, withdrawn, the kind of boy who sat at the edge of a room and watched rather than participated. His early life was fractured, broken home, little stability, and an environment that offered him almost nothing in the way of direction or hope. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun drifting, not metaphorically, literally. He started moving town to town, eventually crossing the border into the United States the way thousands did back then, slipping through gaps in surveillance, disappearing into the anonymity of a vast country that didn't know his name yet. And for a long time it stayed that way, nameless, faceless, just another drifter. His criminal record began quietly enough. Petty theft, burglary, minor assault charges scattered across different jurisdictions in the 1970s and 1980s. Nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that set off the kind of alarm bells that might have stopped what was coming. He was deported from the United States multiple times during this period, yet each time he returned. The border, for him, was not a barrier. It was a revolving door, and American law enforcement, operating in fragmented silos with poor cross-agency communication, never connected the dots. That failure would cost innocent people their lives. But before we get there, you need to understand something crucial about this man, his method of travel, because it is the key to everything. Angel Maturino Reséndiz did not drive. He did not fly. He rode freight trains. Miles and miles of open track that stretched across the American heartland like veins in a body, connecting cities and states, running through backyards and alongside quiet neighborhoods. He learned the schedules, the routes, the hidden compartments of cargo cars. He became invisible on the rails in a way that made him nearly impossible to track. Strike in one town, hop a train, vanish into the night. By the time investigators processed a scene, he was already 3 states away. This is the part of the story where you might feel your stomach tighten. Because think about what that means. Think about how many towns sit right next to railroad tracks. Think about how many families live within walking distance of a freight line. I never giving it a second thought. Now keep that image in mind as this story continues. If you're finding this story as gripping as it truly is, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because there is a lot more of this story still to come, and you do not want to miss a single second of it. The killing that law enforcement would eventually tie as the first confirmed murder in his American spree happened in 1997. The victim was a man whose home sat close enough to the tracks that you could hear the trains from the front porch. Reséndiz came in through a window. He used whatever he could find, blunt, brutal, efficient. He left behind chaos and confusion, and then he was gone. Investigators at the time had no reason to connect this killing to anything larger. It looked like a robbery gone wrong. A terrible tragedy, but a local one. The dots were there, scattered across the map. But nobody had drawn the lines between them yet. That would change in 1998. And when it did, it changed everything. The pace of the killings escalated. August of 1998 brought death to a small community in Kentucky. A young woman named Melissa Montoya. No, let's be precise. Because these were real human beings and their names deserve to be spoken correctly. The University of Kentucky student who lost her life that summer near the rail corridor was a reminder that Reséndiz was no longer operating in the shadows of chance. He was hunting, deliberately, methodically, with a terrifying confidence that only grows in a predator who has never been caught. Then came Illinois, then Texas again. A pastor and his wife discovered in the kind of horrifying intimacy that only happens when a killer enters a home in the dead of night. The pastor, Reverend Norman Williams, and his wife Juanita were killed in their home in Weimar, Texas. They were found by members of their congregation when they failed to show up for Sunday service. The doors of the church were open, the pews were full, and their pastor was never coming. Imagine being the person who walked into that house. Imagine being the one who had to make that phone call. Texas Rangers were now paying attention. The FBI was paying attention. Something was happening out there. Something that crossed state lines, something that didn't fit the profile of any single local case. Forensic evidence was thin. Witnesses were essentially non-existent. Reséndiz was careful enough or lucky enough to strike in places and at times where no one could see him. But slowly, painstakingly, investigators began piecing together a geographic signature. Every scene was near a railroad line. Every scene showed forced entry. Every victim was killed with blunt force using tools or objects found at the location. This wasn't random. This was a pattern. Texas Ranger Drew Carter was among those building the case. Carter was the kind of investigator who didn't let go, methodical, calm, and relentless in a way that didn't make headlines but got results. He and his colleagues began pulling on every thread, running names through databases, cross-referencing criminal histories with known rail routes, and eventually a name surfaced: Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, also known as Angel Maturino Reséndiz. The profile began to sharpen. Mexican national, history of illegal crossings, prior arrests in multiple states, known to travel by freight, known to target homes near rail lines. The case for him as the railroad killer was building, but building and knowing are very different things from catching. And then came the moment that would define this entire investigation in the most painful way imaginable. In June of 1999, Border Patrol agents near El Paso detained a man crossing illegally from Mexico into Texas. Routine stop, routine check. The man gave his name. The agents ran it. And here is where something went catastrophically wrong. The system flagged him. There was a hit, a warrant. His name was in the database. Angel Maturino Reséndiz was standing right there, in handcuffs, detained by federal agents who had every reason and every authority to hold him. They let him go. The exact chain of what happened, whether it was a clerical error, a miscommunication between agencies, a failure of procedure, has been analyzed and argued over for years. But the result is undeniable. They had him, and they released him back across the border into Mexico. So within days, people were dead. In Gorham, Illinois, a couple was murdered in their home near the tracks. Then back to Texas. More victims, more scenes of unimaginable violence, more grieving families waiting for answers that law enforcement was scrambling to provide. The pressure on investigators was immense. The media had caught the story now. The name Railroad Killer was everywhere. Every family living near a freight line in Texas was looking out their windows at night with a different kind of fear. And somewhere in Mexico, Angel Maturino Reséndiz was still moving. By the summer of 1999, the FBI did something they reserved for the most dangerous and most wanted criminals in the country. They put his name and face on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. It was public now. It was national. Tip lines lit up. Investigators across multiple states were coordinating in ways they hadn't before. There was a single focused intensity on finding this one man, but finding him meant getting him back across the border. And that required something law enforcement couldn't manufacture on their own. Cooperation from someone who knew him, someone he trusted, someone he might actually listen to. That someone was his sister, Manuela Reséndiz. Manuela had been quietly contacted by investigators as the search intensified. She lived in the U.S. legally, maintained a normal life, and found herself in an impossible position, torn between a brother she loved and the knowledge of what he had done. Texas Ranger Drew Carter made contact with her. The conversations that followed were long, careful, and emotional. Carter wasn't aggressive with her. He was measured. He understood that forcing her hand would accomplish nothing. What he needed was for her to believe that surrender was the only way her brother survived this. He needs to come in, Carter told her. If he doesn't, there's only one other way this ends. Manuela knew what that meant. Everyone knew what that meant. Men on the 10 most wanted list didn't usually surrender peacefully. They were found. They were cornered. And things happened in those moments that couldn't be undone. She made a decision. She picked up the phone and called her brother. The conversations between Manuela and Angel during those weeks in the summer of 1999 were never fully made public. But what is known is that she spoke to him honestly. She told him what was happening. She told him that the entire country was looking for him. She told him about the families, the children left without parents, the congregation waiting for a pastor who would never return, the woman whose husband found her body and could never fully recover. Whether he felt remorse in those moments, whether her words broke through whatever wall he had built around himself, nobody knows for certain. But he listened. On July 13th, 1999, at the U.S.-Mexico border crossing in El Paso, Texas, Angel Maturino Reséndiz walked up to a checkpoint. He was not in disguise. He was not combative. He walked up to the crossing with his sister Manuela at his side, and he waited. Texas Ranger Drew Carter was there. He had driven to El Paso specifically for this moment. When Reséndiz stepped forward, Carter approached him calmly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no struggle. Carter looked at him and said, in a tone that carried the weight of everything that had happened, "I'm glad you came in." Reséndiz was taken into custody without incident. It was one of the most surreal endings to a manhunt in modern American law enforcement history. A man who had crossed borders dozens of times. He slipped through the fingers of federal agents, traveled thousands of miles on freight trains, evading one of the largest manhunts in years, had simply walked up and given himself up. But the story was far from over, because now came the question of why. And the answer Reséndiz would give, the answer he would stand by in court, in front of a jury, in front of the families of his victims, was something nobody quite expected. This is the moment in the story where things get deeply, uncomfortably strange. Because Angel Maturino Reséndiz did not come into custody with silence or denials, he came in with a declaration. He told investigators, told his attorneys, told anyone who would listen that he was not a man, not in the ordinary sense. He was an angel sent by God. His actions, he claimed, were not murders. They were divine judgments. He had been chosen. He had been sent. The people who died had not died at his hands, but at the will of a higher power working through him. Sit with that for a moment. Because whether you believe it was a calculated legal strategy or a genuine descent into religious delusion, or both, it sets up one of the most dramatic courtroom moments in Texas criminal history. His attorneys argued insanity. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about his mental state, his beliefs, his apparent disconnection from the reality of what he had done. The argument was straightforward. A man who genuinely believes he is a divine instrument cannot be held legally responsible in the conventional sense. The prosecution, led by a team in Harris County, Texas, was having none of it. They focused on the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, the Houston physician killed in December 1998, the case with the strongest forensic evidence tying Reséndiz directly to the scene. Her DNA, his DNA. Physical evidence that told a story cleaner and more definitive than anything else in the case. The families of the victims were in that courtroom. They sat through testimony about the conditions in which their loved ones were found. They heard psychiatric experts debate whether the man in the defendant's chair understood right from wrong. They watched his face as evidence was presented. Some of them said later that the hardest part was not the evidence. So the hardest part was looking at him and trying to find something, some trace of regret, some sign that he understood the magnitude of what he had taken from them, and not finding it. The jury deliberated, and when they came back, the verdict was clear. Guilty. The insanity defense had failed. Angel Maturino Reséndiz was sentenced to death. If you've made it this far into this story, drop a comment below and tell us which moment shocked you the most. And if this is the kind of deep dive true crime content you want to see more of, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel bring more stories like this one to you. The years between his conviction and his execution were not quiet ones. Reséndiz remained vocal about his beliefs. He gave interviews. He maintained consistently and without apparent wavering that he was a divine being who had acted on instructions from God. He described visions. He described a sense of mission. Whether those years sitting in a cell, separated from the rails that had defined his freedom for decades, changed anything inside him, whether the walls closed in on whatever he was, is impossible to know from the outside. What is known is that in those years, investigators continued working. The confirmed American victim count stood at 9, but the shadow count, the suspected cases, and the unsolved murders near rail lines in multiple states that shared his signature haunted everyone who had worked the case. In Mexico, authorities had linked him to at least 8 additional murders, though the actual number was believed to be higher. Communities near freight corridors that had never been thought of as dangerous had changed. People had moved. People had installed locks they'd never needed before. People had started noticing trains in a way they never had. That is one of the lasting legacies of a case like this, not just the families directly destroyed, but the ripple of fear through hundreds of thousands of ordinary lives. The way a freight train can become something ominous, the way a quiet neighborhood near the tracks can feel different in the dark, and the systemic failures. That was the conversation that had to happen and was long overdue. How had he been detained and released? How had he traveled so freely across so many jurisdictions without a net closing around him sooner? The case became a landmark example used in law enforcement training about interagency communication failures, about the dangers of siloed databases, about what happens when the left hand and the right hand of a massive federal system don't talk to each other. Changes were made, systems were upgraded, cross-agency information sharing was improved. None of that brought back a single victim, but it was the only meaningful institutional response available. On June 27, 2006, in Huntsville, Texas, Angel Maturino Reséndiz was walked to the execution chamber at the Walls Unit, the same facility that has carried out more executions than any other in the United States. He had been on death row for 7 years. He had maintained his beliefs throughout. He had spoken to a chaplain. He had eaten a final meal. And now, strapped to the table, with witnesses present, including some of the victims' family members who had requested to be there, he was asked if he had any final words. He did. He looked toward the families in the witness room and spoke words that had been withheld from him for years. The plain, uncomplicated, devastatingly simple words of a man who, perhaps only in his final moments, stepped out from behind the divine mythology he had constructed and addressed human beings as a human being. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped they could find peace. He said he prayed for them. Whether those words meant anything to the families watching through the glass, whether they landed as genuine or too little too late or simply not enough, is deeply personal to each of them and not for anyone outside to judge. What can be said is that those families had waited years. They had sat through a trial. They had endured media coverage and public speculation and the grinding machinery of the justice system. And in those final seconds, they heard his voice say the thing he had never said before. Then the lethal injection was administered. Angel Maturino Reséndiz was pronounced dead at 8:05 p.m. The case of Angel Maturino Reséndiz does not end neatly. True stories rarely do. The families of his confirmed 9 American victims carry what happened with them every day. Anniversaries, empty chairs, the specific texture of loss that comes from violent and sudden death. All the congregation of Reverend Norman Williams rebuilt. The University of Kentucky student who should have had decades ahead of her is remembered by those who loved her. Dr. Claudia Benton's family, the husband, the children who were young when she died, moved forward the way people do, because the only other option is to stop. In Mexico, the families of at least 8 confirmed victims, and potentially more, experienced something different. The Mexican justice system never tried Reséndiz. His execution in Texas closed the American chapter, but left other chapters unresolved. Those families received no formal acknowledgement from a courtroom, no verdict read aloud, no sentence delivered. That silence has its own weight. Texas Ranger Drew Carter, whose patience and steady hand had made the surrender possible, remained with the Rangers. His handling of the Maturino Reséndiz negotiations became a case study in how to approach the families of fugitives, with humanity, with honesty, with an understanding that leverage only works if the person on the other side of it believes you have their genuine interests at heart alongside your professional ones. And what about the trains? They're still running. Right now, somewhere in America, a freight train is moving through the night, past neighborhoods, past houses where families are asleep, through the dark corridors between cities that most people never think about. The rail system that Angel Maturino Reséndiz used as his invisible highway is exactly the same as it was in 1997 and 1998 and 1999. The tracks still run behind backyards. The freight cars still pass at all hours. The network is vast and open and constant. What changed is not the infrastructure. What changed is the awareness among law enforcement, among the agencies who share jurisdiction over borders and rail corridors, among the communities who live along those lines. See, the name Railroad Killer is a permanent part of American true crime history now, not because of the spectacle of it, but because of what it revealed. About gaps in systems, about what happens in those gaps, about the price paid by ordinary people when institutions fail to communicate. There is one final thing worth saying about this story, and it is this. Throughout this case, through the murders, the manhunt, the trial, the execution, one of the most quietly powerful figures, was a woman who never sought attention and never received much of it. Manuela Reséndiz, a sister who carried knowledge that no one should have to carry, who made a decision under enormous pressure that almost certainly saved lives, because a Reséndiz who did not surrender was a Reséndiz who kept moving, who had a conversation with her brother that changed the outcome of this entire story. She did not give many interviews. She did not write a book. She stepped back into her life and carried whatever she carried privately. The complexity of loving a person and knowing what that person did, knowing both things simultaneously and having to hold them in the same heart, is not something that resolves itself neatly. It is not something with a clean ending. But she made the call. She had the conversation. And people who might have become victims did not become victims. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The railroad killer terrorized 2 countries, slipped through the fingers of federal law enforcement, and killed at least 17 confirmed human beings. 9 in the United States, 8 in Mexico, before a woman's love for her brother and a Texas Ranger's understanding of human nature brought him to a border crossing on a July afternoon and ended the run. He was buried not as an angel, but as a man, with a name and a record, and a long list of people whose lives he ended and whose families he shattered. The trains still run. The tracks still pass through quiet neighborhoods, and the story of what happened when one man used those tracks as his hunting ground and what it took to stop him is a story that law enforcement and the rest of us should never forget. If this documentary-style story moved you, educated you, or made you see this case in a new way, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share this video with someone who you think should know this story. There are more cases like this one, more stories that deserve to be told with the detail and respect that the victims and the truth demand. We'll see you in the next one.